The ground crunched under her boots with every step, the dry red dirt cracking like brittle paper beneath her heels. Morning hadn't quite shaken off the night yet. The auction yard sat in that quiet in-between, still, dusty, the world holding its breath. Eleanor Vance walked slowly, hand on the lead rope, her fingers curled tight around a loop of worn leather she'd oiled the night before. Beside her moved a silver-coated stallion, his gait fluid and calm, as though nothing in the world had ever frightened him. But Eleanor knew better. There was a line in his eye today, a question he wasn't quite asking. The sign above the barn entrance read Willow Creek Livestock, paint peeling, one corner broken off. Beneath it, the early workers moved like ghosts, setting up panels, unrolling hoses, preparing paperwork. It was an American horse auction like any other. But today, they whispered about one name, Comet. A record sale was expected. Wealthy buyers were flying in. There were rumors of streaming rights, a feature in equine prestige. Cameras had been requested, but politely declined. Eleanor wouldn't have allowed them anyway. She paused before the gate to the holding pen. Comet stopped, too, sensing her hesitation. His ears flicked forward, then back again, gauging the tension in her grip. She released a slow breath and ran a hand down his warm, arched neck. "Last ride, old boy," she murmured. She didn't mean on his back. Comet had been born in the middle of a thunderstorm 14 years ago. She remembered it in pieces, the way her husband Jim had stayed up all night in the barn, the way lightning lit up the rafters while Comet struggled to his feet, legs shaking, rain seeping through the old shingles. A storm-born foal, Jim had said, full of fire and sky. They hadn't known then what he'd become, a rare mix of Andalusian grace and quarter-horse speed, with a silver coat that glinted like water beneath moonlight. He'd been her husband's last great joy before the cancer came, and now he was her last great loss. "Eleanor," called a voice. She turned to see Toby Harmon, the auction manager, jogging up with a clipboard. "Got the papers all ready. Transport crews on standby for after the final hammer." She nodded, expression unreadable. "You sure you want him in the main lineup? We could do a private room, by appointment. Fewer eyes." "I want him seen," she said. "Let them know what they're buying." Toby studied her a moment longer. "All right then." She handed off the lead line to a handler she trusted, a quiet man named Ezra who had a gentler hand than most. "Keep him in the shade," she said. "No pushing. Let him walk when he wants." "Yes, ma'am." As they led Comet away, Eleanor stepped back from the pen. Her arms crossed, but her shoulders drooped. She didn't cry. Not yet. There wasn't time for that. Instead, she walked across the yard toward the auction office, where a stack of forms waited to be signed. The office was cooler, with a fan turning in slow circles overhead. Papers spread across a metal desk. Silas Dunn's name was already printed on one of the buyer forms, highlighted, marked with a yellow sticky note. Eleanor didn't touch it. She sat and took out her pen, the same silver fountain pen Jim had given her the year they bought the ranch. The door creaked open. A small voice asked, "Is Comet really leaving?" Eleanor looked up. Maisie Thompson stood in the doorway, no taller than the counter, her eyes wide beneath a sun hat too large for her head. She was the vet's daughter, always tagging along, always asking questions. "Looks like it," Eleanor said softly. Maisie stepped inside. "But he's yours." Eleanor studied the little girl. "That's not always enough." Maisie looked confused. "But he loves you." Eleanor closed the pen. "And because of that, he deserves to keep living well." Maisie didn't understand, not fully. But she stepped forward and held out a folded piece of paper. A drawing, bright crayons on wrinkled notebook paper. Comet, with wings, flying over the ranch. "You can keep this. Maybe he'll come back." Eleanor took it without speaking. Her hands trembled a little. Back outside, the auction began to swell. Horses moved through the chutes, one after another, their values assigned in quick numbers. Eleanor stood near the rails as a Palomino filly was sold for $20,000. A bay gelding fetched 35. All solid animals. None like Comet. She felt eyes on her. Rich buyers in tailored jeans, sunglasses too dark, smiles too polite. She ignored them. When the auctioneer cleared his throat and raised his voice above the din, "Next up, a rare offering. Registered under the name Silver Comet. Silver Stallion, 14 years. Trained in reining, cutting, dressage, and liberty work. One of a kind. Opening bid at 50,000. The gate opened, and Comet stepped in. The air changed. Conversations paused. Phones rose. Whispers scattered. He moved like water. Fluid. Every joint precise. He didn't spook at the crowd. He didn't shy. He circled once, then twice, calm and luminous. His silver coat glowed under the lights strung above the yard. Eleanor could hear the intake of breath from people who thought they knew horses, until now. The bids came fast. 70. 85. 120. Someone from Utah pushed it to 200. A breeder from Georgia raised to 310. A man from California cracked 400,000 with a nod. Eleanor didn't watch the numbers. She watched Comet's ears. His tail. His breathing. He didn't know what any of this meant. To him, it was another show ring. Another loop in the pattern. She clenched her jaw. 500. 725. 900 even. The final jump came from Silas Dunn, seated comfortably with his boots crossed, sunglasses perched in his collar, the smirk on his lips barely contained. 1.3 million, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Silence. Then the gavel dropped. Sold. Applause. A whistle. Someone clapped her on the back, muttered something about legacy. Someone else asked about breeding rights. Eleanor didn't answer. She turned slowly and walked away. Comet followed the handler toward the transport stall. He didn't look back. But Eleanor did. She walked behind the barn, away from the voices, away from the heat. She sat down on an overturned bucket, the drawing still in her pocket. She pulled it out, stared at it until her eyes blurred. And then, finally, she let herself cry. Not loud, not shattered, but deep, like something buried long ago had surfaced and broke open without warning. She buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook. Behind her, the auction continued. Horses came and went. But Comet was already on the papers. And she had signed them. Yet something in her still whispered. He was never supposed to leave. The air that evening was heavier than it should have been for spring. It pressed down like something unsaid. The wind had gone still after the sale, as if the world itself had exhaled and left Eleanor to figure out what remained. She stood beneath the porch light, keys in hand, watching the trailer parked along the gravel stretch behind the barn. The transport crew had arrived precisely on schedule. Clean-cut men in branded polos moved around efficiently, double-checking locks, laying fresh straw inside the stall, checking the ventilation fans twice. They worked like it was just another haul, just another load. One of them, a man with a kind face and a clipboard tucked under his arm, walked up to her gently. "We'll be loading him first thing, ma'am. Papers are all signed. Weather's good for travel." Eleanor nodded, her jaw tight. "How long will it take?" 2, maybe 3 days. We stop often. Don't want to stress him." She managed a small sound in response, something between thanks and acknowledgement. Then she stepped down from the porch and walked the familiar path toward the barn. Her boots moved slow, toe to heel, the crunch of gravel beneath her the only sound in the stillness. The overhead lights in the barn were dimmed. Most of the other stalls were empty now, horses sold, transferred, gone. The auction was over. But in the last stall, toward the end of the row, stood Comet. He had always looked too big for those wooden walls. He turned his head as she entered, eyes soft in the warm light. Not nervous. Not excited. Just watching her, like he always did. Eleanor approached slowly, her fingers sliding across the top rail. She didn't speak right away. The silence between them didn't demand it. 4 years, they'd talked without words. In arena corners, in early morning round pens, in the quiet breath before a ride. She finally said, "You did well today." Comet lowered his head. She reached up, pressed her palm to the space between his eyes, and let it rest there. "I thought I was strong enough for this." She didn't finish the sentence. Her throat closed around it like a vice. She stayed with him for a while, leaning her forehead against his mane, letting the warmth of him anchor her, even as she tried to sever the thread. Later, she fetched his grooming kit from the shelf, laid out the brush and currycomb and hoof-pick in a perfect row. It had been a ritual once, shared with Jim. He'd taught her how to brush with rhythm, not force. To read a horse's back like a book, find the knots, the sore spots, the tension and trust. Tonight she worked slowly, each stroke deliberate. Comet leaned into her hand the way he used to when he was a colt. She brushed out every last tangle, polished the silver in his coat, cleaned the burrs from his tail, then picked out his hooves like she had 100 times before. When she finished, she sat in the straw across from him and stared at the barn door. "I used to think this ranch would never let me go," she said. "Like if I just held on tight enough, it would hold me back." She paused. "But I've been fooling myself. It's been letting go of me for a while now. One piece at a time." Comet nosed the air, then stepped closer, his breath hot on her cheek. "You're the last piece," she whispered. Just then, the barn door creaked open behind her. Footsteps. She turned. Maisie, small and careful, held a mason jar with a little light inside. "Fireflies. They help me sleep," the girl said simply. "Thought maybe they could help you too." Eleanor stood, dusting straw from her jeans. "That's very kind, Maisie." The girl stepped into the barn, unafraid, and stood beside Comet. She looked up at Eleanor, her voice hushed. "Is he scared to go?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked to Comet. "I think he knows something is changing." Maisie nodded solemnly, then took the jar and unlatched the top. Fireflies scattered into the dim air like quiet sparks. She whispered something too soft to hear and touched the stall rail before turning and heading back into the dark. Eleanor stayed there a while longer, watching the insects blink slowly overhead, watching Comet turn in his straw and lie down with a long, slow breath. The next morning came with sharp light. Too clear, too bright. The world moved with purpose while Eleanor moved with weight. The transport crew arrived again, fresh coffee in hand, clipboard checked, trailer open. They were polite, efficient. They didn't ask questions. Comet walked beside Eleanor without resistance. No rope was needed. She led him out of the barn, across the yard, and up the ramp with a grace that felt both practiced and entirely unbearable. He paused at the top, halfway inside, turned, looked at her. That was the moment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden panic, no rearing, just stillness, eyes locked, a breath between what was and what would be. She touched his shoulder, let her fingers rest there a beat too long, then gave a small nod. He stepped inside. The ramp closed. The latch locked. The trailer rolled away. She didn't cry. Not then. Not in front of them. She went inside, made coffee, and sat in the chair Jim used to occupy. The one with the worn leather armrests and the dent in the cushion. And that was when the silence turned into something else. Not emptiness. Absence. She opened the ledger on the kitchen table. The numbers stared back. Enough now. Enough to cover the land, the repairs, the debt. But the house didn't feel saved. It felt hollow. She looked around at the walls they'd built together. At the photo of Jim on horseback with Comet's young head just visible over his shoulder. She could hear his voice like it was carried on the creak of the wind. "Don't sell your heart to save your hands." She closed the book. That afternoon, her phone rang. Toby's voice crackled through the speaker. "You got a buyer on the line, wants to schedule press. National spotlight. You ready for that?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Not today." "Sure. I'll put em off." She hung up, walked to the porch, stood there while the wind came back. It carried dust from the road, smell of sage, the faintest echo of hoofbeats, imagined, maybe. She stared into the distance and wondered if Comet was looking back. Wondered if he missed the sound of her voice. If, even now, his ears turned when she called him in her mind. Then she did something she hadn't done since before Jim died. She saddled the old mare in the back pasture. A horse too slow for work but steady beneath her. And she rode. Not fast. Not far. Just to remember what it felt like. The feel of leather. The creak of reins. The way wind stung the eyes when you weren't hiding from it. By the time she returned, the sun was low. And the ache in her chest had changed. It still hurt. But now, it had room to breathe. Rain began just after dusk, soft at first, like a whisper that wasn't meant to reach the ground. Eleanor stood at the back window with her hand resting against the old wooden frame, watching the drizzle thread down the glass in uneven lines. She hadn't expected the sky to open tonight. The forecast had called for dry wind, dust. Another brittle evening in a season full of them. But the rain had come anyway. Unexpected. Uninvited. She didn't turn on the lights. The house sat in a quiet hush, each creaking floorboard and ticking clock magnified by the absence of Comet's presence. For over a decade, she'd known he was out there, just beyond the porch, behind the barn wall, standing in the pasture with his silver coat catching starlight like it belonged to the heavens. Now the barn was empty. The stalls stripped clean. The saddle hooks bare. Her fingers touched the pocket of her flannel shirt where she kept a folded copy of the transfer papers. She hadn't looked at them since the trailer pulled away, but she knew every line of that document like it had been etched onto her bones. Sale of property. Bill of transfer. Ownership rights. She'd sold him. She'd had to. It was the right thing to do. Wasn't it? She left the window and stepped into the hallway, drawn by some ache she hadn't been able to shake since the trailer turned at the ridgeline and vanished into a cloud of grit and sun. Rain pinged softly on the tin roof above her. She walked toward the back room, the one Jim used for storing gear, feed receipts, little projects he never quite finished. The room hadn't changed in years. His coat still hung on the peg. The faint scent of cedar and tobacco lingered like a ghost that hadn't figured out it was gone. On the shelf beside the old desk sat a weathered photo in a chipped frame. Jim, hat tipped back, sitting cross-legged in the straw, grinning as Comet, just a colt, stood beside him with a curious tilt to his ears. That had been the day they'd started training him off-lead. Jim had whispered, "You can't force a storm. You just learn when to stand still." She touched the glass, her fingers trembling more than she liked. Behind her, the house creaked again. The rain grew louder. A knock came at the door. She froze. It was late. No one ever came this late. She opened it cautiously, heart kicking in her chest. Toby stood on the porch, hat in his hands, rain glistening on his shoulders. "Evenin', Eleanor." "Toby, what are you doing out in this?" He hesitated, looked past her like he wasn't sure she'd let him in. "Something's happened. I thought you ought to know." She stepped aside without asking. He entered, dripping quietly, boots leaving small muddy prints across the worn floor. "It's about Comet," he said softly, and her chest tightened. "What about him?" Toby lowered himself into one of the kitchen chairs, set his hat down on the table like it carried weight. "He didn't take to the new place." Eleanor blinked. "What do you mean?" "He's been off. Not eating. Kicking the stall. Won't let their handlers near him. Vet cleared him, says he's healthy. But something ain't right." She said nothing. Toby cleared his throat. "Silas called me earlier. Asked if I'd talk to you. Talk to me about what? He hesitated. They want you to come out. Try to calm him. Just for a bit. Let him see you're okay with it. The breath went out of her in a slow rush. And if I'm not? They're saying if he doesn't settle, they'll return him. On breach. But not to you. They'll move him into managed care. Resell him. The word stung worse than she expected. Managed care was code for isolation. Regulation. Bland handlers with cold gloves and checked boxes. Eleanor swallowed. Where is he? Place outside Lexington. Dunn's estate. She gripped the counter behind her. Her knuckles turned white. She hadn't even let herself imagine where he'd gone. Kentucky had been a name on paper, not a place. Now it was a pin in her gut. I don't have a ticket, she whispered. I booked one. You leave in the morning. She looked up at him sharply. He met her gaze. I know you, Eleanor, he said gently. You ain't slept proper in days. And he ain't eaten since he left. You think that's a coincidence? The next morning, Eleanor stood alone in the boarding terminal. Her travel bag was small, packed with little more than a change of clothes and a worn leather glove she hadn't touched in years. The flight was loud and cramped, the kind of ride that made her bones ache. When the car pulled up to the gates of the Dunn property, she stared in disbelief. Acres of polished paddocks, white rail fences, immaculate barns with copper roofs, grooms in uniforms, polished tack hanging in precise lines like museum pieces. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt wrong. She was greeted by an assistant with a clipboard and two bright eyes. He led her through a gleaming aisle of stalls, each one pristine. They stopped at the last stall on the left. Comet stood motionless inside, his head low, eyes dull. Not scared. Not defiant. Just gone. Eleanor's breath caught. She opened the stall door without waiting for permission. Comet's ears flicked toward her. She stepped in, slow and measured. He didn't move. She reached out, touched his neck. Hey you, she whispered. He shuddered. And then, he leaned into her. The handler outside whispered, He's never let anyone in. She ignored him. Her fingers moved across Comet's coat like she was reading a story written in muscle and memory. I'm sorry, she whispered. I thought I was giving you a better life. I didn't realize I was taking something from you. He huffed softly against her chest. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. Silas Dunn stood at the end of the aisle, arms crossed, face unreadable. Didn't expect to see you again, he said. I didn't expect to need to come back. Silas stepped forward. He's valuable. But if he's not willing, he's a liability. I bought an asset, not a mystery. Eleanor looked up. He's not for you. You sold him. I sold his body, she said. Not his spirit. Silas opened his mouth, then closed it. Comet shifted beside her, standing taller now. Eleanor ran her hand down his nose, whispered something that only the horse could hear. Then she turned to Silas. I want him back. Silas raised an eyebrow. At what cost? She stepped out of the stall, reached into her bag, pulled out the check she'd never cashed. I never wanted your money. He stared at her. You'd walk away from a record sale? I already did. Silas glanced at the handlers, at Comet, and then, without ceremony, he nodded. Eleanor led Comet out of the barn that afternoon. No trailer, no handlers, just a quiet promise that he was going home. When the plane touched down, rain was falling again, gentle, steady. They rode in silence back to the ranch. No one waited at the gate. No fanfare. But when Comet stepped out and turned toward the pasture, he lifted his head high and let out a sound that echoed over the hills. A call. A declaration. And Eleanor, tears on her cheeks, whispered, You're home. What she had lost wasn't value. It was belonging. And what she reclaimed couldn't be bought. The pasture was soaked when they arrived, and the tires left deep grooves in the dirt leading up to the barn. Rain had softened the earth, turning the landscape into a living watercolor, washed out greens and silver sky, streaks of amber mud curling along the edges of every hoofprint. Eleanor stepped down from the truck first, her boots squelching as they hit the ground, and turned back just in time to see Comet step calmly off the ramp. He paused, ears swiveling forward, nostrils flaring as if tasting the air for something long forgotten. Then he lowered his head, exhaled a long, slow breath, and stood perfectly still. No halter. No lead. Just trust. Eleanor didn't speak. She didn't call to him or coax him forward. She simply opened the gate to the pasture and stepped aside. He walked in without hesitation. The moment his hooves touched the familiar grass, something in his frame shifted. A tension unwound. The kind of tightness that doesn't come from ropes or confinement, but from the quiet ache of knowing you've been misplaced. He didn't run. He didn't rear. He just stood in the center of the pasture and lifted his head to the wind. Then, with a suddenness that stole the breath from her lungs, he bolted forward, not out of fear, but joy. He ran with his mane tearing sideways, tail flaring like a banner, mud flinging from his hooves as he thundered along the ridge that bordered the field. Water splashed up around him in small bursts, catching the light as it fell in arcs. Eleanor leaned against the fence and watched, her chest tight. Her breath came in little stutters, like her lungs didn't quite believe what her eyes were seeing. He looked like he had the night he'd first run free on this land, barely 3 years old, the storm still in his blood and wonder in his eyes. The ranch felt different now. It wasn't just about bills or drought or the weight of upkeep. It was something deeper, a sense of balance returning, of a place remembering itself. The wind moved like breath through the open spaces. The barn doors creaked on their hinges. The pine trees whispered along the fence line. And for the first time in what felt like years, Eleanor stood in her own silence and didn't feel hollow. Later, after Comet had grazed for a while and settled in the hay-strewn corner near the back wall of the barn, she brought out the saddle, his saddle. The one she and Jim had crafted piece by piece when money was tight but hope was endless. She hadn't touched it since the week before the auction. Now it felt like holding hands with memory. She didn't plan to ride. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. But she cleaned it, oiled the leather, checked the stitching. The act itself was enough. A ritual of return. As the sky deepened toward evening, a knock came at the front door. She wiped her hands on her jeans and opened it to find Maisie standing there in rubber boots and a rain jacket 2 sizes too big. Her cheeks were red, and she held something behind her back. "I saw the trailer come back," she said without preamble. "Is he okay?" Eleanor smiled. "He's more than okay." Maisie grinned and revealed what she'd hidden, a small wooden sign painted unevenly in bright blue letters. It read, "Welcome home, Comet." Eleanor took it gently, her throat catching. "Did you make this?" "Me and Daddy," Maisie said. "He used his woodcutter. I did the paint. It's beautiful. I can hang it by the barn if you want." Eleanor stepped aside. "I'd like that very much." As Maisie hammered the sign into place, Eleanor stood in the doorway, arms folded across her chest, eyes wet but peaceful. Comet stood just beyond, his silver coat glowing faintly in the dying light, his head turned toward the sound. He flicked an ear, stepped forward, and let out a low whicker. Maisie turned and whispered, "He remembers." Eleanor nodded. "So do I." That night, she lit the fireplace for the first time in months and sat with an old album on her lap. Pictures of Jim, of colts and calves, of summers with cracked hands and long days under the sun. The house no longer felt like a relic. It felt like a story still being written. The next morning, she received a letter in the mail. The envelope was crisp and white, the handwriting elegant. Inside was a personal note from Silas Dunn. He wrote that he'd reviewed her cancellation and respected her decision. No lawsuits. No claims. Just a single sentence at the bottom. "Some things belong to legacy, not to business." She folded the letter and filed it with the transfer papers, then tucked them both away in the back of a drawer. By midweek, the vet had stopped by to check Comet. Routine, nothing urgent. He pronounced him strong. Healthier than he'd looked in months. He's calmer now, the vet said, patting the stallion's shoulder. Like he's got his heartbeat back. Eleanor fed Comet by hand that evening. After he finished, he stood close, his forehead pressing lightly into her shoulder. She leaned into him, no words exchanged. None needed. And then she made the choice she hadn't let herself consider until now. She opened the barn side door, pulled out her boots and gloves, and fetched the bridle. This time, when she saddled him, he didn't move. She led him to the edge of the pasture, mounted up in one smooth motion, and turned him toward the ridgeline trail. The wind kissed her cheeks as they moved, not fast, not hard, but enough to lift the hair off her collar, enough to feel alive again. Comet's hooves were steady beneath her, and every breath she took felt like it reached all the way down to the places inside her that had once gone quiet. They rode until the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the valley. She let him stop at the top of the rise, where Jim used to bring her coffee in the mornings before the heat got bad. From there, she could see the whole ranch. Fences she'd fixed with splinters in her palms. Paddocks where colts had been born and broken and healed again. The house that leaned a little more each year but still stood. She took it all in and let it anchor her. Then she turned Comet gently toward home. The ride back was slower, deliberate, as if the path itself was savoring every footfall. When they returned to the barn, Maisie was waiting with her father and two of the ranch hands who had once left when the place had begun to fall apart. They didn't speak, just nodded as she passed, their faces soft with something that looked like respect. That night, Eleanor wrote one final letter. To herself. She didn't sign it. Didn't address it. She just wrote, "You made the right choice." Not because it made sense. Not because it fixed everything. But because it was true. And truth is what horses understand best. She folded the letter and slid it into a journal beside the fireplace. In the morning, there would be chores. Maybe another storm. Maybe not. But tonight, she stood on the porch, warm mug in hand, as the rain began again. Slow, soft, forgiving. And in the pasture, a silver stallion lifted his head to the sky.